Okay, hello there and welcome. It's time for another little book review if you don't mind. So today it's the turn of Alfred Bester's The Star's My Destination. So I'm going to stick the cover up there in slightly more detail, scan version of it. But later on I'm going to probably run up some of the older editions too. This was first published back in 1956. So one can only imagine there's a veritable bonanza of other covers available, but we'll see them as we go. I haven't seen them yet. I'll be doing that in the future. Anyway, I'm reading this upon the recommendation of a number of you from my book haul video when I featured this book. One of you said, I'm sorry I can't remember your name, said that I'd be in for quite a ride. And you weren't joking, were you? It's absolutely bonkers. But we'll get to all that a bit later. To my knowledge, Alfred Bester, according to the front page, he only published 7 novels, according to this. And the fact that 2 of them appear within the Masterworks collection tells you a lot. This book particularly is held in very high regard. Quite an important book for a number of reasons which I'll get to later. The only one I've read of his was The Demolished Man, which I read about 20 years ago, I suppose. I found it hard to get to grips with the style within which that was written. I'd probably fare better with it now. But this one was a lot easier to get into, I thought. Even so, there were some difficulties here and there. But anyway, before we do anything more, I'm just going to give it another little sniff. I know I sniffed it last time, but we'll see if it's the scent has altered from me reading it. You never know. No. Yep, still smells of fish and chip paper. Lovely, lovely aroma. But this is a brand new edition, so it's going to smell pristine, shall we say. And by pristine I mean fish and chip paper. It's that kind of, well, it's not cheap paper, but it's mass-produced paper, pulp. Anyway, let's have a look at the cover itself. So this particular illustration was done by Chris Moore. Now, I think it's an absolutely wonderful painting, but I noticed something. My eyes went straight to his forehead because there's a moment in the book where the name Nomad is tattooed on his forehead. And if you look at the enlargement here, you can see that the word Nomad is actually mirrored. So before I read this, I just assumed that was like Cayman, maybe. But of course, it's Nomad backwards. So I'm assuming that the publisher mirrored the image for this print edition, and people wouldn't necessarily know that that's happened unless they've read the book and then study this chap's forehead. Anyway, I'm getting beside the point. So anyway, let's get to a very, very short synopsis. I'm going to keep this short because so much happens in the book that I couldn't faithfully synopsify the whole thing, if you will. So I'm just going to set it up. So the whole thing revolves around this chap on the front cover with the tattooed face, one Gulliver Foyle. And we find him at the very beginning of the book marooned on a dead spaceship. So the spaceship has been perhaps attacked, it would seem. So there's no one else left alive on the ship. And he's in a kind of maintenance cupboard filled with air that he keeps having to pilfer from the storeroom on another part of the ship. So he's got like a leaking spacesuit, so he's having to go out and risk his life, blacking out, all sorts of things. He survives like that for 170 days, or what is it, 6 months, something like that, more than 6 months, 7 months, I don't know. Anyway, he thinks he's hallucinating this happening at the beginning, but another ship appears, one that would, conceivably rescue him. Unbelievably, the ship passes on. The ship's called the Volga. And poor Gulliver goes off his bloody head when this happens. But this steals him into a mindset of wanting to survive and seek revenge over the people that have abandoned him in this situation. So this is pretty much the book in a nutshell. It's about revenge. This chap is hell-bent on revenge. So as it makes pains to describe at the very beginning, this chap isn't anything special. He's just a grunt. He's been going through life just doing things willy-nilly, not really excelling at anything in particular. But this one event galvanizes him, and over the course of the book we see him change in various ways. The first change, of course, is physical, because upon escaping at the beginning, which is quite an interesting thing to read about in itself, he finds himself within the company of these, like a kind of cargo cult, I suppose you would say, out in the asteroid belt. And they've been like collecting bits of broken spaceships and bolting them onto an asteroid, and that's where they live. And so whilst he's passed out, they just tattoo his face in this grotesque manner, and they call him Nomad. Perhaps because he's arrived on what's left of the Nomad, his ship. But later on, he also goes through other transformations. I suppose it's a kind of, he's finding morality by the end, you're hoping, because he comes across as, he's so driven by his revenge that he's very unpleasant. He does some very unpleasant things, not least of which just randomly raping a woman near the beginning. It doesn't go into any detail. I didn't even understand at the time that had happened, but then I had to go back and I realized that that's what he had done. And this woman had done nothing against him, and so he's using people to try to further his aim to get to the root of who left him there, who was piloting the Vorga and things like that. So anyway, that's a kind of potted synopsis. Now, this story of revenge plays out across most of the solar system, and so in a relatively small book, we're covering a lot of distance here. I mean, this would be like a grand space opera in the hands of other authors, but this is like a bloody laser beam fired right through the story. We go to Mars, we're on the moon, we're in the asteroid belt, we're on Earth. But adding to this kind of frenetic pace is the idea of jaunting, which is central to the whole story. So jaunting is the ability of humans within I think it's the 23rd century, 24th century. By using the power of the mind, you can teleport anywhere. I mean, there are rules in place. So the authors thought about this quite a bit. You can't jaunt any further than 1,000 miles away. And depending on how good you are at it, determines how many jaunts you might be able to make in a day and how far you can go. 1,000 miles appears to be the limit of a jaunt. Interestingly, I read the short story by Stephen King from the book Skeleton Crew. That I thought he had turned this. So that story was about teleportation, and it was called Jaunting. And so he's obviously taken it from Alfred Bester. It was a brilliant idea. Obviously, it's completely bonkers, and there's no kind of scientific rigor as to how this might be allowed to happen within this universe. But it's really fun, and it's worked out really well, to the extent that it's altered the way commerce works, the way wars are fought, all sorts of things. There's these they're called jack jaunters. That's another thing. So if people they're kind of burglars. So if you can imagine, you could just jaunt anywhere. You could easily burgle people's houses, things like that. That was really interesting. But the jaunting becomes central to the whole idea of the book later on, because there's something that Gulliver has done in the past, something he can do that no one else can do. Anyway, there we are. I had to keep reminding myself that this was written in 1956. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. This could be a book that was published recently. You know, there's so much in it that isn't of the 50s per se. Considering, you know, it was still 13 years away from man landing on the moon, if you believe in that. I do personally, but maybe you don't. The concepts of hard vacuum and jet propulsion through vacuum, all those different things, they're quite well realised. The science part of the books is flimsy, shall we say? I mean, that isn't the main concern here. It's more about the story. This man being driven to enact his vengeance. But there's so many wonderful ideas there that don't necessarily adhere to any kind of science that we could ever imagine, but they are there and they're really interesting. So there's a nice, just remembered here now, there's a moment where he's placed in this prison, and it's a jaunt-proof prison, so it's buried right underneath the earth. You can't jaunt out of it, it's impossible, it's just solid rock. And they're in total darkness. So one of the rules of jaunting is you need to know exactly where you are before you go to where you want to be. And where you need to know exactly where the other place looks like, if you know what I mean. There's kind of coordinates, so to speak. But because they're kept in complete darkness underground, you can't jaunt. But some of these poor prisoners get so depressed under there that they just go for a jaunt. So I think they called it blue jaunting, maybe, something like that. But they jaunt and they just instantly die. So they must jaunt and just end up, well, perhaps in the middle of the rock, or sometimes people jaunt and they just disappear for good. I think that was the genesis, perhaps, of Stephen King's short story about jaunting. But there we are, that's beside the point. I won't give any spoilers at all. I mean, there's so much I could divulge, but I won't. But it's another interesting thing, actually, towards the end. When things start going a bit bonkers, metaphysically speaking, the text itself starts going crazy. So there we are. This becomes an absolute nightmare to read, I must say. So you've got a kind of Union Jack effect here. And this kind of thing, it gets really experimental at the end. So that was quite interesting. Another side note, so in the beginning of the book there's an introduction, and they describe the fact that when Alfred Bester was writing this, he did a lot of it in the UK in a little cottage, and so he got the names of the different characters and different places from a phone directory and a map. So that's why a lot of the names that appear within the book sound like towns in England specifically, although you might not know that if you're not from the UK. For example, one of the characters is called Dagenham, and he's a really interesting character. He's at some point he was involved in some kind of accident, and he was exposed to really hard radiation, and so I mean, he should be dead by all rights, but he isn't. But the fact is, he's now very radioactive, so you can't be around him for more than 5 minutes at a time. So he gets with this woman later on, someone that was with Foyle before, and they, if they do Congress, shall we say, it has to be quite quick, and also. They then have to retire to separate bedrooms so that he doesn't kill her with his radioactive body. This is one of many interesting little snippets that appear throughout the book. Okay, so why is this book so important? I don't know the full ramifications of why it is, but the main one appears to be that it was the genesis of what became the cyberpunk movement of the 80s. I haven't read much of that myself, but although I've read William Gibson's trilogy, the Neuromancer trilogy. And you can see the genesis within this book. We have Gulliver, who later on becomes kind of augmented. He has various cybernetic implants, which allows him to move far quicker than anyone else. He's stronger, all the rest of it. You've got these like big multinational companies that are more powerful than governments. You've got the great big spanning epic scale of the setting, but also a kind of imminent war always on the horizon. There's also a secret weapon in the mix, and that's tied up with the ship that Foyle was originally marooned on. But those are all little tantalizing tidbits that I'm not going to talk any more about. But if you haven't read it, I would really recommend reading it. In fact, if you're not even a fan, or you haven't even read much science fiction, this is a really good place to begin, because it just moves so quickly. You don't really need to know much about science itself. You don't need to have read much science fiction to really appreciate it, because there's a really interesting story within the mix, and everything is described, explained to a certain extent. So yeah, you'll be okay. So if we're now looking at the rating, my rating changed as I was reading, I suppose. It fluctuated between 4 and 5 stars, I must say. I think a lot of people they'll give it 5 out of 5 just because of the importance of the book. Obviously, you have to read it within the context of when it was written, which is incredible. I mean, if we consider the book with what we know now and what science fiction has existed since that point, then we know that this book is important, that it's served an important function in the past. That said, the way it's written, as frenetic as it is, there's parts of it that I found hard to kind of be carried along by. A couple of times I was having to flick back through pages to work out who was who, where they were, what they were doing. It was a little bit like that. So each chapter is a kind of a jaunt in a way. It's its own little segment of the story, and sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect between them. That said, it was still brilliant, so I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5 stars. I know it's perhaps some of you think it's sacrilegious for me not to give it 5, but 4 will do for me as a personal perspective on the story itself. In terms of its importance to the genre, yeah, I agree. It should probably have 6 out of 5. It's a beauty. But there we are. There we are. There we are. There we are. Okay, we'll leave it there for now. I'm currently reading the 4th book of the Dark Tower series, and it's a massive book. So I've been struggling to get through that, but that will be the next review. I've also got some more books on the way. I've spent so much money this month on books. I'm just addicted to it. But there we are. So there'll be another book haul at some point. As well. But anyway, let's leave it there. Apologies, it's been a bit hit or miss today. I've got a bit of a headache, and yeah, I've had to re-record this a number of times, shall we say. Anyway, thanks for watching, and see you next time. Cheerio.